St. Martin said, they take away the punch bowl when the parties run a little bit too long. And that they were starting to do. And you needed that to wash away the unsustainable excesses. Yet here we are, 12, 15 months, 18 months later, no recession, I don't see one in sight. And in fact, we're pretty much migrating to the soft landing now. So the first thing I want to look at is what actually happened. The policy response off the charts. If you look at the chart on the left, this is nominal GDP. This is just dollars spent. We're taking out the inflation component. We go back and we draw a straight line with the financial crisis because everyone knows that took a decade out of growth and eventually we caught up. Look at the scale of the policy intervention. The US economy is at $27 trillion. According to this line, we're supposed to be at $22 trillion. Forget about the dip for the pandemic. We're already miles above that. 5 years of forward GDP have been rolled forward into this year. It's so far off the chart that when you look at the chart on the right, we haven't seen the scale of this policy intervention except for the build-up to World War II. That's what's sloshing around in the system, and that's going to be very important as we start to get into what we're thinking about. Also, by the way, in terms of policy response, the regional banking system, I maintained that the Fed delivered a 300 basis point rate cut. Yes, you heard that right. The Fed cut rates 300 basis points. It was targeted at the banking system, but it worked. And if you think about what was going on at banks, they had securities portfolios, rates went up a lot, they put them in riskless securities, agency mortgages and treasuries. Their average portfolio is about 85. Bank portfolio has about a 5-year duration. Now you're able to take those 85 cents on the dollar securities, 100 cents on the dollar. Yeah, every that was more like a TARP moment. It took a couple quarters for us to realize what was going on, to be fair, and realize that actually the policy response was just generating a level of economic activity that wasn't going away. So I could sit here and get all nervous about a lot of kinds of things. I was there a year ago. It's a dark place. You end up buying a lot of high quality duration and gold and wonderful things like Bitcoin. Just kidding on that. Yeah. And then you realize that the world has moved on. And you realize today the Fed has actually delivered on a textbook soft landing. Here it is. Here it is. Full employment. Tomorrow, I guarantee we're going to see the 26th consecutive month of unemployment at 4% or lower. You hardly ever get there. We're going to roll in this 26th consecutive month. Job one, done. Price stability, look at inflation. What is the Fed telling you that their measure is? Their measure is core personal consumption expenditures. You could look at it year over year. We look at something a little shorter. 1 month doesn't make sense, 3 months doesn't make sense. How about the last 6 months and annualize that? Where are you? 1.9%. Actually, for the second consecutive rolling 6-month annualized measure. Right there at their 2% target. Actually, look at the 3 months and annualize that. You're at 1.5%. They should have cut rates back. Like wage gains, they're pretty much down at their 3.5% target. So they're, I guess in the end, what we've seen happen is whether it's the amount of whether it's the policy responses that are ongoing. We all know the Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, all those are still being spent, whether it was in the banking system or it's just the passage of time. Businesses and households have absorbed the higher rate environment. You're starting to see housing turn up a little bit, even though housing affordability is quite low. Businesses are starting to invest again. And all of that looks pretty good to us. So we're in the soft landing. We're not seeing anything out there that's telling us it's going to change it. That's the kind of environment that we want to invest in. Before I go into what we're doing, it may flare up every so often. To the downside, you go barreling in recession. And the Fed is just too slow to normalize policy. And cycles I lived through, 95 is the one that stands out. That was the one soft landing. From January 94 to January 95, the Fed doubled the Fed funds 6%. And that slowed things down a lot. Actually, I was surprised going back and looking at it. 95, U.S. Steel defaulted, you had the Mexico tequila crisis, and actually Orange County defaulted. And that was in a recession? Well, because the Fed came in and started cutting rates. So you can have these crises, but if the Fed starts coming in May and bringing rates down, then soft landing is here, I think, for a while. The downside also, I think, incorporates two known knowns. The first is central business district office properties. You're starting now to see some of the pain of that percolate through the system. I work in Midtown Manhattan. I was telling Christina, look out of our buildings left and right, and if you're not in a JP Morgan building, you're building. We like to come in 5 days a week and keep Jamie company, and he appreciates that, I'm sure. The thing that's a big concern is having a look at C&I loans, because that's one of the places the rate shock has been delivered that is still starting to percolate. And if you think about a lot of commercial and industrial, they were put on at 4 or 5%. Just think about that. So credit spreads were 400 to 500 basis points. It's 2021. There's whoever you are, good luck. Now as they're coming in to roll them 5.25%, 5.5%, it's 5.53, something like that. And credit spread and small market borrower, they're closer to 5 to 7%. 9 to 12% broadly for a sector of the economy. So that's the downside. The upside is things just start to take off again. Businesses and households have absorbed the risk. You're starting to see that as long as the consumer is fully employed and real wages are tell by my British accent, I spent 10 years in London. My favorite, I was there 2000, 2010 during the Great Migration. U.S. bankers to London. My favorite definition I heard of an American was somebody who buys things they don't need with money they don't have. There you go. If you're fully employed and you've got positive wages, you're going to spend, and I'm not going to fight it. Okay, let's go down and mess up the slides. Sorry, Christina. Let me talk about what we're doing in because in a soft landing, the Fed has capacity to bring down rates a lot. The current rate regime is designed for inflation that was close to 2%, and for an economy that on a nominal basis, we're not there. If they leave rates where they are, again. So they have to start bringing down rates. So either in soft landing or hard landing, these are bull markets for bonds. Central banks cutting rates are important accelerants to bull markets. How far can the Fed go? I think they can bring it down to 3.25%. So that's just over 200 basis points. I think that puts the 2-year Treasury at 2.75% to 3%, and the 10-year Treasury at 3.25% to 3.5%. I want to see all of those. Guarantee you're going to win something. I'm not sure what it is, but you'll win something. Pete, I talk to clients, and clients think I've lost my mind. Like only 175 is and they'll be lucky to do 100. The Fed is telling us 2.5% is their long-term neutral rate. I think that's probably not true. Their neutral rate, and they look at R-star, which is the real Fed funds rate, which they think is about 0.5%. I think over the next, for now, coming down to 3% to me makes sense over the next 12, 18 months, and I think it's quite possible they'll have to go even lower. Soft landings are great for corporate profitability. That's what we're seeing now. We bought everything, and I'd like to say we use our credit research, names, but I know we own investment grade, we own high yield, we own bank loans, securitized credit, we own agency mortgages. It's all just sitting out there. Investment grade universe today, the aggregate bond index, this morning it was yielding 4.65%. It's down a little bit from there. At the end of 2022, December 31, 2022, it was yielding exactly the same thing, 4.67%. So think of that, 13 months ago, and today the investment grade aggregate bond index is yielding the same. 13 months ago, you had 4 Fed rate hikes in front of you. Now we think you're looking at a minimum of 4 Fed rate cuts. The last thing I'm going to throw in here is the U.S. The big investments we're making is to look overseas and where we're taking on foreign bonds, particularly in emerging markets, take the currency. The correlation is clear. Once the Fed starts to cut rates, that's when the exceptionalism of the dollar ends. So I think we're looking at something like a 30% appreciation in yen versus dollar. A lot of that driven by the Fed bringing rates down, and some of it actually driven by hiking rates. And by the way, in 2021, yen was 30% higher than where it is now, but then the Fed started hiking rates, and that served as a propellant for the dollar. So there's lots to like in the bond market now. You can buy it where you got it 13 months ago. We're trying to encourage clients to do that. I'm going to leave you with one last anecdote. And 2 days ago, I did a call with a wealth management platform, Sophisticated Smart in Miami. And the woman I spoke to told me that her clients were 65% in stocks, 35% in bonds. That 35% in bonds is in cash. What should she do? And of course, she wanted the yields back in November. I'm like, you're not going to get them. And here's what's going on. And at the time, yields were even another 10, 20 basis points higher. Everything is going to change when the Fed starts cutting rates. And I thought, her knowing you're at the same yield level as 13 months ago could get her there. And she said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to put money in bond funds. You're the 30th client, 33rd call, 3 clients require 2 calls. 30th client I've had this conversation with since the December pivot in the Fed when they turned dovish. You're going to be the first one that actually puts money in the bond market. And so this afternoon, I texted the client advisor, and guess what? They did not put money in the bond market. Well, yields are where they are because of the money that's already here. not the $6 trillion in money market funds, not the de-risking that needs to happen in pension funds, not what insurance companies have to buy, not what official institutions overseas are planning to do. That hasn't come in yet. So I think we're in for a good macroeconomic environment, and hopefully after 2 kind of suspect years for bonds, a really good year for bonds.
I have a question before you sit down. What in the bond market do you not like?
What would you avoid like crazy in the bond market right now?
I think there are a lot of high-levered companies that have taken on low-cost funding that have to roll it over in this environment of infinite free money that are starting to struggle. And those are the ones that are heading to restructuring. I don't want to be part of that. There's enough money in the private capital space to go in and absorb these companies and do the restructuring. So what we're screening out are levels of leverage where there's been a lot of margin compression and where we don't have confidence.
Like what?
There are still a lot of businesses in the banking industry. Don't forget the Bank Term Funding Program runs out in another month and a half. There's a lot of places in retail, and there are a lot of industries that have been counterparties to the property market, and we think that's still going to struggle.
Something. I'll stay here. Next is Christina Cooper, who is Chief Global Market Strategist at Invesco. She basically is in charge of formulating all their strategies at Invesco. What jumped out at me on your resume is that you were a teaching fellow at business school at NYU in macroeconomics and organizational behavior. I would have loved to have taken that class. I can't fill out your questions. If you have them already, hold them up. We have people coming around to get them and get them to me so that I can collate them and get you as many as possible when we're done with the panelists. So,
What price Bitcoin will be next year?
take it away.
Bitcoin 100,000 or Bitcoin 1
It
million?
is such a pleasure to be with you all. I feel now the need to be a little funny because Bob was very funny on here, and I was trying to think, what anecdotes can I tell? I didn't work in London for 10 years. Well, I can tell one funny story, which is would not apply to Jane, but you may, if anyone has seen me on CNBC, you know I look entirely different. This is do-it-yourself hair and makeup.
Oh, I know.
I ran from CNBC to pick him up at the bus stop, and I had my hair, and the bus pulls up, the door opens, and no one gets out. And you know, you hear those horror stories about children left in the back of buses or at school, and so I ran right over to the driver's side to ask the bus driver where my son was. Was he asleep in the back? And she said, "Oh, no, he doesn't want to get out because he doesn't recognize you." So at least you can say he knew stranger danger. Okay, so let me start, because I think that's the only thing I'm going to be funny about tonight. So Bob, hopefully I was able to be a little funny. Let me start by talking about, or giving you a summary of our outlook. I think Bob was right on. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay, great. I think Bob was right on in talking about the backstory, because it has really been an extraordinary number of years where we turned on and off a global economy. We turned off and then on a global economy like a light switch. We threw an enormous amount of stimulus, both monetary and fiscal this time. We only really did monetary stimulus during the global financial crisis. And then, of course, we had some very, very significant inflation, and we had to tighten really dramatically. So we have kind of a screwed up economic cycle. We have markets that have reacted unusually because there have been so many artificial forces at work, in my opinion. But we've worked through a lot of this, and I think we are on the road to normalization. And so our views for 2024 reflect that. First and foremost, uneven disinflation. It's going to be imperfect, but we are very much on what I will call the D train, the disinflation train. We're not going to the Bronx. We're headed to the 2% target that the Fed has laid out. I don't know if the Fed will be comfortable by mid-year that they'll see that in coming months, but I believe very strongly that we will get there by the end of this year. And I think that's very important because the Fed, and I'll get into the Fed in a second, but I do believe that we are going to start to see cuts, and I'll talk about timing in a minute. Slow down, number 2 point, slow down in the first half of the year. Yes, this economy is quite resilient, and there are a number of reasons why, but we are going to see some, what I will call a bumpy landing in the first half of this year, followed by a re-acceleration in the back half. This was a lot more relevant a little while ago. Obviously, we've seen the peak in policy, and we are going to start to see cuts. I still believe it's the second quarter, not in March. And risk appetite is likely to improve. We've already seen that. I think that continues as markets discount recovery in the back half of this year, and also get something of a tailwind from monetary policy. So let me start by talking about progress in disinflation, and I'm going to juxtapose the U.S. with the UK. Interestingly, if you look at the U.S., at the Fed's forecast for inflation in September and then again in December, we've seen improvement. That hasn't been the case in some of the other countries. But if you look, and we heard it from Jay Powell in the press conference yesterday, on so many measures, we're seeing the progress that we need to see. And it's not just goods, although he focused on that. We're seeing real improvement in services inflation as well. And we got the employment cost index the other day, the most comprehensive wage growth or compensation growth gauge, and it's certainly improving. It's not where we need it to be, and not every data point is going to be perfect, but it supports that larger trend. Now, there are concerns about some issues out there, like, as you talked about, we have 2 wars. One in particular is causing some problems in the Red Sea. That's one of the areas that we have to focus on, because that could drive up supply chain pressures. We know what happened in the midst of the pandemic when we had a lot of supply chain pressures. You see this index and how dramatically it rose. I will say that thus far it hasn't had a dramatic impact. In fact, if we were to look at the most recent PMI surveys for the Eurozone, they are conducted by Hamburg Commercial Bank. Some of what they gleaned from the survey was that companies had diversified supply chains in reaction to COVID, and of course also some frosty relations with China. And as a result, they're less affected today by the attacks in the Red Sea because those supply chains have been altered. So there's a resilience there. Also, we've heard it from Christine Lagarde in her comments last week that they certainly had a material impact, but not as bad as they would expect in terms of the Red Sea attacks thus far. Of course, we want to watch it closely, but I don't think it's going to have a big impact on the disinflationary trend. Also, consumer inflation expectations. I can't stress how important they are to the Fed and other central banks. They really pay attention to them, especially consumer inflation expectations. And what have we gotten from the Michigan survey? We've seen a lot of progress. There have been spikes when oil prices have gone up, and that's normal, but they've come down, and they've come down quite dramatically. Now, I always like to, just for a frame of reference, juxtapose what inflation expectations are like today versus what they were like in 1980 to understand why Paul Volcker did what he did back then and why we didn't need to see that this go round. So the dark blue bar represents 1980. The medium blue bar represents 1990, and the royal blue bar represents last month. And what you see is that in 1980, consumer inflation expectations were off the chart. Prices were expected to rise by 10%. And of course, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because consumers then buy and drive up prices. I'm so sorry. You know, I was told I had to do these 2. And I apologize. All right, I need a keeper. So that's Michigan. That's the chart I just talked about. There we go. And here's the bar. Sorry about that. Boy, you let me go a long way before you start. Feel free to shout out right away.
I'm looking at it, you're like, okay, I'm
Yeah, I
following.
have 3 teenagers, so I'm very used to being heckled and corrected all the time. So really, don't hesitate to do it. So what you see is 1980 was an unusual period of time in terms of consumer inflation expectations becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is not what we're seeing today. In fact, the term the Fed likes to use is that inflation expectations are well anchored, and I think we can really check the box on that right now. Even though they need to come down, we're not at 2%, they're very much moving in the right direction. Okay, now I'm gonna have to do my sequence. Now, having said all that, the economy is slowing down. I don't think it's dramatic, but I wouldn't describe it as a soft landing because to me that connotes no damage. And I think there will be some damage. That's what happens when you have an aggressive tightening cycle. And quite frankly, in any tightening cycle, you can see things break. And we certainly have seen a real tightening in bank lending standards, a lot of the conditions that lead to slowdowns. That's okay. I don't think it's going to be dramatic. In fact, I often get asked the question, why has the U.S. economy been so resilient? And I think a lot of it has to do with that very, very tight labor market. You might feel a pinch from inflation, but you're still able to buy some things. You might switch to generic brands. You might alter spending habits, but you're still shopping, and I think that makes a big difference. Also, we have this grand privilege, which I'll get into in a minute, of, in fact, let me get to it now. So it's called a long-term fixed-rate mortgage. We have it in a lot of Western developed countries don't. And so you can see that little blip during the global financial crisis when adjustable rate mortgages went up to more than 40% of outstanding mortgages. But for the most part, what we've seen and where we are today is over 90% of outstanding mortgages are long-term fixed rate. Anyone want to guess what the average rate is on all those outstanding long-term fixed rate mortgages? Gosh, you guys are good. 3.62%. So that's why, unlike our Canadian neighbors and many of our European neighbors, we don't feel the kind of stress they have felt with tightening. And I think that has made a significant difference. That positions us well to see a re-acceleration in the economy in the back half of this year. And I think some of it will certainly be helped by an improvement in real income. And I also think that we'll start to see cuts in the second quarter. That will also be something of a positive catalyst for the economy. And so that's where we get to a very rapid recovery or a brief slowdown. Whoops, what did I do now? Okay. I should not be allowed to handle this equipment myself. I'm sorry. I hope I don't break it. Okay, so third point. Are we going to be higher for longer? As you can see, I wrote this slide a little while ago. But this is important because the dot plot that the Fed released in December shows an expectation, a policy prescription of 75 basis points in cuts in 2024. And like Bob, I don't think that's what we're going to see. I think we're going to see more. I anticipate 100 to 150 basis points in cuts this year. Now, why would you say that if they're saying it's 75? Well, this is just a friendly reminder of the Fed's accuracy in predicting its own actions. And this goes back to the December 21 dot plot. That's the left bar. And you can see that they anticipated 90 basis points for the Fed funds rate at the end of 2022. Lo and behold, it was 433 basis points, so slightly off, and suggests that there's some wiggle room this year between what the Fed has forecast in December and what we are going to see by the end of this year. Now, an important point to make, and yeah, I've got to make sure I got this right, something that Jay Powell said the other day, which actually echoes some comments Chris Waller made, the Fed governor, back in November, which is the Fed does not need to see a weakening of the economy to cut rates. That's the key takeaway from yesterday's press conference. It's confirmation of what Waller was saying a few months ago. We don't need to wait for that. We don't need to see weakening to have 100 to 150 basis points in cuts. In fact, what Waller said was that if the decline in inflation continues for several more months, we could start lowering the policy rate just because inflation is lower. It has nothing to do with trying to save the economy. It is consistent with every policy rule. And I think that's really the critical thing to focus on. So I know there were some that walked away from yesterday's press conference, and certainly markets behaved like it was a real disappointment because, quote unquote, Powell shut the door on March. I'm not sure he 100% shut the door on March, but I think that matters far less than how much the Fed will cut this year, and I think it will be more than it forecast. One more reason to cut rates. This is something that never gets mentioned in the FOMC minutes. As far as I know, it doesn't get mentioned in Fed meetings, but it has to be a consideration. And that is the enormous debt service burden of the United States. Thank you. Nobody, come on. And you can see it in this chart. We've seen debt go up, and now we're actually seeing rates go up. And that is causing an enormous amount of pressure. I think the projection for this year is that as a line item, servicing our debt is going to be a bigger chunk of money than our defense budget. And that is not sustainable, right? I think many of us have read Reinhart and Rogoff and seen the impact of high debt on growth. But the real impact comes from your debt servicing costs. And they're very, very high, and I think it's quite unsustainable. Now, some of you might remember the commission, the Simpson-Bowles Commission, that came about more than a decade ago to try to figure out ways to reduce the deficit. And they tried valiantly. It was a bipartisan effort. They really couldn't arrive at much and didn't have a material impact at all on just cutting the annual budget deficit, let alone impacting the high level of debt we have. My takeaway from that is that it's much easier to just cut rates if you want to lower your debt servicing expenses. So just one more reason. Now, on to a few more points. So our expectation is we see that recovery in the back half of this year. Markets discount that in advance. And what does the recovery trade give us? Well, better performance from emerging markets, typically from small caps, typically from international in general, as well as cyclicals. And so this could very well be the playbook this time around. I think we are going to see that come to fruition. We've seen glimmers. We'll see that broadening of the market. I think that a weakening dollar will be a very scenario this year. So I always like to we have our base case, which is a bumpy landing. Again, not a recession, but soft landing. That is not my base case, but that would favor riskier asset classes. And then, of course, there is still that potential for a hard landing. Tightening that has already been done, because there is a lagged effect, right? And it can be long that results in. Is if the Fed is not satisfied with the progress of disinflation, we see some kind of, my opinion, for asset classes, especially here. And one argument for emerging of valuations over time, and look at what the average is, as well as where we are today, which is that blue dot. And as you can see, things look very attractive for emerging markets. They're close to the low end of their range. Now, China is at the absolute bottom of the range, and I think it is to at least consider exposure to China, because policy can make a big difference. I think it will really deter on China. But there are opportunities outside the U.S., and there are really good arguments for diversification, if for no other reason than rarely predictive in the shorter term. There needs to be could be a weakening dollar, could be the Fed cutting rates. I think that, and all we have to do is look look at past rate hike cycles and what happens in that 1 year period afterwards. They perform better than other asset classes. In my opinion, investment grade credit looks very attractive right now. Could very well be the sweet spot that could weather.
A couple questions. So do you think emerging markets outperform the U.S. this year?
I do.
And when will the debt matter? When will it matter?
It's mattering more. We can't even pass any kind of long-term budget. We're rolling over every couple of weeks, essentially, to approve a short-term funding plan. That, to me, is we're getting closer to that breaking point.
You-hoo. I think the other side of that.
Let's do it already. Hold on. Bob?
I think more bad decisions get made in the markets on supply-demand, particularly Treasury supply and government supply, than anything else in the markets. And I look at, and I get that this is the second question I get from clients, is the staggering amount of issuance. It's like, well, what do you want? We had a pandemic. It could have killed us all. Policymakers did what we needed them to do. There was unlimited fiscal and monetary support. It worked. We came up with the vaccine in a record amount of time. We're all here. I know we lost people along the way, but we're all here. And now it's time for the central banks and policymakers to drain that from the system. And I think that's what's going on. And when you look at the amount, by the way, the Rogoff-Reinhardt papers were fully discredited, so they're not out there anymore. That there was, remember, there was a cell error, and then UMass Amherst went through it, and
There was a cell error, but the general premise, that was sort of suggesting it gets really bad after a certain level of debt. But I think it still shows that growth is impacted by that.
it hasn't in Japan. We'll see about China. And I think we have to remember that the amount of debt is self-regulating. It got borrowed and it's spent. It's the reason unemployment is in the mid-threes. It's the reason GDP is where it is. It's the reason that the U.S. economy is healthy. As all of that starts to slow down, then of course the Fed starts to bring down rates. So the cost to the U.S. government is going to go down. And by the way, the last thing, I started in itself below 10%, and rates immediately dropped from 16% down to 0.3 a couple of years ago. And then one administration later, in Clinton, we had a balanced budget. So there's plenty of growth to pay down debt to GDP, and I understand why the debt to GDP is up.
Before we bring up Ed, is there a rebuttal?
Well, I would just say that I was using Reinhard Rogoff as an illustration, but really what matters is the interest expense. So Japan can get by because it's paying nothing in interest essentially on that debt. But the more you pay, the more problematic it is for growth.
Christina, thank you. Let's bring up Ed Jardine. It rarely happens. They're always so nice to each other. Oh, you make an excellent point. And this is also so far the most positive forecast in our participation. It is out. I think that's about
Okay, thank you. Okay, this is the fourth.
Sorry, real quickly, if you have questions, during the start right in.
Okay, first, I'd like to thank your society for inviting me. I appreciate being a co-panelist with these very bright people here, and I was very interested in their presentations. This is a forecasting dinner, so I'm going to get right down to it. I think there's three historical analogies for the current decade. One is the 1920s. It rhymes with the 2020s, and so maybe this is going to be a repeat of the 1920s. If you recall, which I doubt you will, except in the history books, there was a war that was called the Great War. They didn't have World War II, so right before the Roaring 20s, we had a terrible war. Millions of people died, and the soldiers got very sick, and the Spanish flu spread throughout the world once they came back home, and that killed millions of people. And so if you think about what people must have been thinking in 1920, it must have been pretty depressing after all these horrible events. And indeed, in the United States, there was something called the Great Depression. I mean, they did, it was called Depression, not the Great Depression, but they didn't have the term recession, which doesn't sound as ominous as depression, but that's what they called it back then. So one had to be extremely pessimistic in the early part of the 1920s, and look what happened. It became the roaring 2020s, and there was an era of tremendous technological innovations, things like plumbing, things like tractors, electricity, appliances, dramatically increased the standard of living for people, and it was a great period. I know it ended badly in 1929, 1930, but that's the government screwed it up with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, but we don't have to go there. The other historical paradigm, perhaps, is the 1970s. Now, it seems like, we're not going to do that. It looks like we had Russia invaded Ukraine in early 22, and we had an oil price spike, especially energy prices soared in Europe, and they rose rather dramatically here. The administration felt that they had to sell some of the strategic petroleum reserves. But here inflation's turned out to be transitory after all, not persistent. I think what has been surprisingly persistent is the unemployment rate being so low, below 4% for so many months. So unemployment has been persistent, inflation has been transitory, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't still play out the 1970s. The 1970s had two energy shocks, and the energy shock that we had in 1979 was related to the Iran Revolution. 73 was the Middle East War. And so it's conceivable that the way things are going in the Middle East, we could have another energy shock. Oil prices could go up again dramatically, and we could have another wage price spiral. So I don't think we can just totally dismiss the possibility of 1970s happening again. And then there's the 1990s, which I think is also a possible analogy. Back then we had irrational exuberance in the late 1990s. People were very excited about the internet. They were very excited about telecommunications companies that basically provided the equipment for the internet. Cisco was the biggest company at that time at its peak. Now we've got NVIDIA, and everybody's excited about artificial intelligence. And a lot of that is real, but some of it is hype, and it's possible that this thing kind of feeds on itself and becomes another bout of irrational exuberance with multiples going a lot higher, and the mega cap 8 stocks becoming even bigger components of the S&P, and the rest of the market perhaps joining in, but the focus basically being on technology and being overstated. So, which one is it? Well, you can play this game at home with your family and friends. Just put some probabilities on it. And I would put a 60% probability on the roaring 2020s. I would put a 20% probability on a repeat of the 1970s and 20% on a repeat of the 1990s. I was very pleased that Powell did not talk dovish at the press conference. I think that would have been a huge mistake to get everybody excited about rate cuts occurring in March and more to come. And from Powell's perspective, he's a student of history. He knows that he's facing these challenges. It could turn out to be pretty good, but on the other hand, it could be the 70s. Does he really want to lower interest rates and only to suddenly see the Middle East create an energy shock and then suddenly having to reverse that and kind of replay what happened to Paul Volcker? Does he really want to make the mistake of Alan Greenspan, who in 1996 did a little Hamlet on us and said, how do we know if stocks are irrationally exuberant? And maybe they weren't all that irrationally exuberant then, but they got more so as a result. So I'm all for the Fed holding off on lowering interest rates. I don't think the economy needs it. The economy is doing absolutely fine. True, the Fed has raised interest rates from 0 to 5.25%, but that's tightening for sure. But it's also normalization. Interest rates are back to where they were before the great abnormal, which is the period that we have, or the new abnormal, which is the period between the Great Financial Crisis and the great virus crisis. And now we're seeing the 10-year tips is at 2%. I think that's a reasonable real rate. The 10-year bond yield, nominal yield is 4%, a little less than that right now. I think that's a reasonable rate. The economy has demonstrated that it can live with it. Now, why is that? Well, there's a few explanations, but clearly the most important one is the consumer. Why has the consumer been so resilient? I've not been in the hard landing camp. I've been in the soft landing camp, and arguing that it could actually be a no landing. I'm a bit of a contrarian, so when I recognized that this was the most widely anticipated recession of all time, I said, nah, it's not going to happen. And then this economist...
You were the one.
I was the one. So now I'm due to be completely wrong about everything. So beware. But the reason I was the one is I really have, I'll share this with you. I have some inside information. That helped. I didn't do it all by myself. I've got 5 kids. I'm an optimist, obviously. Did it with 3 wives, so I'm a super optimist. And I've been accused of being impermeable, which I take as a compliment. I want on my tombstone that they'll say Eddie Ardeni was usually bullish and usually right. You look at the stock market, it usually goes up. Now, I'm really good at calling bottoms. I'm still working on tops. And that's partly because I have this bias to the idea that you really need to hold stocks for the long haul. So I share that view with guys like Buffett and Jeremy Seal. But I have had some really good calls in calling bottoms. And here's my secret. I have a relative who calls me at bottoms and says, Eddie, should I get out? This is a guy who never talks to me. Never hear from him. But at bottoms, he calls me up in a panic. What should I do here? Does my broker know what he's doing? So I've had that insight. And the consumer, I've got 5 kids, and 2 of them are still on the budget. They graduated from college, but they can't afford rent, so they're living at home. And one of them, my daughter, I just recently took her off the credit card, but I'm thinking of putting her back on because of an amazing insight into the consumer mind. So she's helped me a lot. I never told her this, and don't share this with her because she'll think that she should get her credit card back. But look, I also have an advantage of being a baby boomer. When I was younger, I thought I was special. I'm special, but then I started looking around as I became a forecaster, and I said, I think there's 75 million people like me doing the exact same thing. We had this corporate view that when you got out of college, and we all had to go to college, and when you get out of college, you get yourself a job in a corporation, where you hope that you're going to work there the rest of your life. It should be, you should make a good career there. And maybe you started out without a title, but soon after a year you became an AVP, then a VP, then an EVP, then I guess it was an SVP along the way. And if you tell us the millennial today said, are those new Bitcoin categories? Well, what is that? Okay, the idea of rising in the corporate environment is not something that the current generation is as aware of as the baby boomers were. And then we moved to the suburbs, and then we had kids, and then we got steel appliances, and we got granite counters, and everything was hunky-dory. So, I made the mistake of having 5 kids. I love them, but the last 2 cost me an arm and a leg in college. I don't remember it being that expensive for the first 3. Well, they're still home, and people say, that they do surveys and say, something like an amazing percentage of people are living paycheck to paycheck, and they don't have enough to really make it through the end of the week. I think a lot of them are children. And what the surveys don't get is they ask the kids, have you run out of money? And they don't tell you, no, mom and dad gave me some more. Okay, so what we have here is your friend Jamie Dimon in May of 2022 warned everybody that a hurricane's coming. He said, not right now, everything looks pretty good, the consumer's in good shape, they have all this excess savings that they're accumulating during the pandemic, but they're going to spend it, they're going to run out of it, and then they're going to have to retrench. And then other people said, oh my God, consumer credit, revolving credit just got up to $1 trillion. Like somewhere in the Constitution or the Bible it says, $1 trillion you shall never cross. And consumer credit's never forecast recessions. Never. What it does, it tells you how bad it's going to be if something else triggers it. At any rate, I think that what's missing in this discussion is an insight into the baby boomers. They're retiring. My friends are retiring. I'm a little bit jealous, okay? But actually I'm not. I don't play golf, and I really think this is the most fun business one could possibly be in. Keeps you young, keeps you thinking. And so the baby boomers have a lot of money. The household sector has $150 trillion in net worth. $150 trillion. The baby boomers have $75 trillion of that. This is the richest household sector we've ever had. It's the richest senior citizen population we've ever had. And my friends are saying, hey, they sat around there for a couple of months during the pandemic and said, what's really the meaning of life? Shopping, traveling, not working. What do we retire? What do we save all this money for retirement? So they're sitting on $75 trillion, and now there are a lot of them thinking, okay, how much of that? How do we spend it? We maybe live a long time, and maybe we need some caregivers that isn't covered by health care. How much do we want to leave the kids? Nothing. Why leave them anything? They didn't listen to you. They didn't clean up their rooms. They're bums. Okay? But the kids know that the parents can't spend it all, and something's going to be left over. So the savings rate's going to be remarkably low for the next several years. The baby boomers aren't saving anymore. Instead, they're going out to breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the early bird specials, and in between those early bird specials, they're going to see healthcare providers to make sure that they can travel 3 or 4 times to Europe and climb Machu Picchu and all these things. And so,
In summary,
in summary, everything is going to be great. 5,400 on the S&P by the end of this year. By the end of 5,400 by the end of this year, at the end of next week. I'm working on the training. 4,600 last year. We got that by July. So things happen pretty quickly these days. 6,000 on the S&P by the end of 2025. No recession. The reason for that is because the consumer's in good shape. We're onshoring. The economy is amazingly resilient. And by the way, there's one word that I really wanted to spend all the time talking about, and that's productivity. We've had some amazing productivity numbers coming out recently. We had one this morning. And for the past 3 quarters, we've had productivity growth of basically 3% at an annual rate. That is fairy tale dust. I mean, it's fairy dust. It's what makes the economy grow. And I think the surprise is the economy is going to grow not at 1 to 2%, not at 2 to 3%, but maybe 3 to 4%, because I think productivity is going to be awesome. And that's because we've got a labor shortage, and technology solves problems. And the problem of labor shortages is being solved by technology. Thank you.
As many of these as we can, but based on what you said on technology, let's quickly, the 3 of you didn't really talk about AI, and the impact it could have. When do we see that impact, and what does it do to the job market? Let's start with you, Christine.
So I think we start to see the low-hanging fruit probably already. McKinsey put out a report a few years ago saying one of the areas of opportunity call centers, and I think that's a perfect example because a lot of information is needed. The faster you can do it, the better off you are, the greater customer satisfaction. And it's not that humans are removed from the equation; they're just utilizing AI to answer questions more quickly and efficiently. And that model, is something that can be taken to other places. We've been talking about how at meetings AI can summarize, put together notes and summarize within minutes after meetings. There are all kinds of things. There are a lot of efficiencies and productivity enhancements that are coming already from AI. Now, there are bigger things, I think, to come, for sure, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit already that is being helped.
Bob?
We use it in a lot of places at JP Morgan already. We created our own internal sandbox. I was saying earlier to the group that we have a strategy meeting on Tuesday. It's a half hour, 3 analysts go through it. I ran that meeting this past Tuesday, and the 7 minutes it took me to get from the meeting when it ended to my desk, our internal ChatGPT had already written up the minutes, and they were perfect. It was the exact word count we asked for. I think there are endless uses. I also think this is like the .com was back in 2000. I think the whole internet and .com turned out to be far greater, bigger, more impactful than anything any of us imagined in 2000. And yet, the companies that were there in 2000, very few were the ones that are here today. And there was a consolidation and a shakeout. So that could happen as well. I think AI is here and it's going to be big.
Ed?
I paid $20 per month for ChatGPT deluxe version when it came out. And my goal was to have it write my daily commentary and then just read and
How's it working?
life would be good. I spent more time finding the errors and correcting them than if I just sat down and wrote the damn thing. So I'm a little skeptical. I mean, it's artificial for sure, but it's not intelligent. It's a bit of a hoax. It's a bit of a scam. Microsoft's writing it for all it's worth. NVIDIA made a lot of money with game chips, and that kind of ended. And then Bitcoin mining, and that ended. So, what about artificial intelligence? Yeah. So I think NVIDIA could turn out to be like the Cisco stock of the 1990s. That's where irrational exuberance comes in. The big concern I have now, and I had dinner with some folks in Newport Beach yesterday with a fellow by the name of Professor Gary Smith. He was actually on my dissertation committee at Yale many years ago, and he's written things about the AI hoax, and so I'm kind of a follower of a lot of his analysis, and he's a statistician. And he says that the big problem that he sees now is that garbage in, garbage out, and artificial intelligence does a really, really good job of creating disinformation faster than any human can possibly do it. And as this garbage starts to accumulate, it'll completely pollute the internet. You won't know what to trust. And so I think that it's going to create a lot of confusion. And my roaring 2020s doesn't depend on artificial intelligence. It just depends on there's a labor shortage.
Did I hear you right? You're betting that 60% that we have a repeat of the 1920s. That's where you're putting
Yeah,
it on.
roaring 2020s market keeps going higher.
And then,
No, I mean, the 29 was a policy mistake. Have to be back again before the end of the
okay. I think your kids are off payroll.
Right? Spanish flu.
Christina, Dr. Bond. Well, and what balance?
So, first of all, I think there's very little exposure to fixed income in the average person's portfolio. I think, as you talked about, the fixed income allocation is in cash. And so I think